Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the new installment of the Core Humanities Visitor Writings series. I'm Daniel Morse, the Fitzgerald Distinguished Professor of the Humanities here at UNR. I'm also teaching the English department, and I want to thank you all for joining us. I have a few people to thank before we get started, and then I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker. So first, I want to thank the Fitzgerald family for their generous gift to the Core Humanities program. This is my last presentation as the Fitzgerald Distinguished Professor of the Humanities. So I want to thank everyone in CH for making it such a welcoming second home to me, particularly the director, Catherine Fusco, but also Chris Stansel, Bretton Rodriguez, Stephen Pasqualina, and Richie for hosting tonight's event. Okay, so now on to our speaker. Dr. Sejal Sutaria is visiting assistant professor of 20th and 21st century post-colonial literature at Grinnell College. She holds degrees from Kenyon College, the University of Exeter in the UK, and the University of Michigan, where she earned her PhD in English. Her first book project investigates what largely untapped oral history archives and BBC radio programs produced between 1940 and 1990 reveal about the development of anti-colonial resistance enacted by Britain's South Asian diaspora. Sejal was part of an interdisciplinary research group based out of King's College, London, investigating the history of the BBC's World Service. She contributed an article on Venu Chitale to 100 Voices that made the BBC on the BBC's website, a chapter on Dalit literature to an edited collection, as well as an article on T.E. Hum to Global Review. She also recently contributed a chapter on Indian writer Malkraj Anand, who my CH students have read or are going to soon, to Indian Sound Cultures, Indian Citizenship, an edited collection that came out from Michigan in 2020. Because of the overlap in our research interests, Sejal has become a valued friend and very informed interlocutor. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce her here at the University of Nevada, Reno as part of the Core Humanities program's Visiting Speaker Series. Sejal, take it away.
Hey, Dan, thank you so much for such a warm introduction. Dan is also a really cherished friend and valued colleague, and it's been really great to dive into this radio studies adventure together. Thanks to everybody at UNR, to Chris Stansel for assisting me with all of the preparations for this gathering. And yeah, really happy to be here. And I look forward to sharing with you the format that Dan and I thought we would employ is for me to share the work that I'm doing on Chitale for probably the first half of our session, and then bring Dan in to a conversation where he'll share what he's been working on, and we'll talk about how the two projects kind of intersect with each other and how we've both been able to explore the mysterious Venu Chitale, who until recently really hadn't been excavated or studied as deeply as she deserves. So it's really exciting to have found her. So Dan is kindly assisting me with the PowerPoint, and I will ask him to read off things from the slides for you, because he can do that a bit more fluently than I can. All right, so thank you for being here again, and here we go. So slide number 1. All right.
Okay, so right now we're on
so today we are talking about cooking in wartime, and specifically wartime here means World War II. And to do that, we're bringing together several different historical realities to give us the context for our person of the hour, which is Venu Chitale. So Venu Chitale was born in 1912, died in 1995. She is best known for her work as a BBC radio broadcaster from 1940 to 1945, where she worked on the home, we can go on to the next slide, on the home service of the BBC. This is all radio at this time. The Eastern service, which I'll tell you more about in a bit, but it was primarily the services that were broadcasting radio transmissions to various parts of Britain's empire, which considered vast portions of the earth, but we'll be looking particularly at the Indian arm of the Eastern Service that was launched in 1940. She also was a Marathi speaker. She's from the state of Maharashtra. I used to imagine that India looked like an ice cream cone. I've been since told by people that some say it looks like a diamond and other people say it looks like the statue of a woman, but need it before we get too far down that track, I'll say it's on the northwestern, maybe more western side of India, and used to be known as the state of Bombay when she was living there, and eventually in the 1950s become separated into two states. Anyway, back to Chitale though, she also broadcast on the Marathi service. So she was speaking vernacular languages and delivering news broadcasts, music programs, etc. We won't be talking about those today, but it's important to share that this was something that she contributed to. And then she also broadcast to military forces, so the armed forces network. So our focus today, though, will be on the first two services, the home service and the Eastern service. Okay, so to give a little bit of context, Dan, can we go on to the third slide?
You bet. So this is about food shortages.
Yeah, so to give you context here, there are two things that are going on. The first is that the career Venu Chitale began in 1940 on the BBC was a time of England's increasing involvement, Britain's increasing involvement in World War II. And at the time, in 1940, Hitler was approached by Italy and Japan. And both of them said, listen, you know, India, which is a major colonial holding of Britain, is in the throes of its movement for national sovereignty, for independence. So why don't we endorse this independence? Because we want to topple Britain, undermine its power. And Hitler actually refuses. And he thinks to himself, well, no, I actually want to ally with England because I want the UK, well, not the UK then, but Britain to be a kind of junior assistant to me, Germany. And maybe we can merge our empires and let the Aryan race do the ruling of the world. And so he really woos Britain. And Britain doesn't budge. They're not interested. And he pushes a little harder and he pushes a little harder. This is in the winter and the spring of 1940. And then finally, by summer, he gets very frustrated and decides, well, I'm going to invade France. And we have the experiences of Dunkirk, and I'll talk about those in a moment. And then on September 7th, he decides that he's finished, he's had enough. And so he decides for 2 months to bomb Britain nightly. And this is known in popular nomenclature as the Blitz. So he bombs daily parts of Britain, but particularly London, 2 months solidly. And meanwhile, he has U-boats, so German boats, blocking off ports. And so what results is a food shortage. And this concerns Chitale because she will be broadcasting the program that we're talking about, which is the kitchen in wartime and how to make vegetarian dishes. So I'll get back to that in a moment. All right, and next slide, I think, is about India. Let's quit India.
Yep, you got it.
Okay, so the Quit India movement is one of the heights of an escalating Indian anti-colonial nationalism. So at this time, during World War II, India has been a colony of Britain's informally since the late 18th century, and more formally since its turning over from sort of regulation by the East India Tea Company to British government powers and Queen Victoria in 1857, after what the Brits refer to as the Mutiny and Indians refer to as the War of Indian Independence. And so in 1857, Britain tightens its grasp on India as its colony. And then by the late 19th century and early 20th century, political forces in India, people that are vying for national sovereignty, or at least more sovereignty from Britain, join forces to create the Indian National Congress in 1885. And they initially want just more independence, but eventually they decide that after the 1919 massacre, and I can address that more in the Q&A question answer session if we want to, but it was basically an open fire on people that had innocently gathered to be part of a fair by General Dyer and his military forces in 1919. And after that, people decide, you know what, it's time for Britain to leave. And Gandhi sort of mobilizes people and says to Britain, you know, you will leave. You don't think you will, but you will. And so he launches his nonviolence movement. And this is important because by 1940, India's movement is getting stronger, and Britain's need for Indian support is also getting stronger because they need India to support Britain, both in terms of providing soldiers to fight on the fronts in Europe, but also to make sure that India is not seized by Japan, that is fighting a land battle over China, Burma, etc. So I'll leave that there, but maybe one last thing I can say about this is that for Chitali, and this is very important, she is really caught because she's an Indian living in Britain, and she needs to demonstrate her allegiance to the British government, which is really worried about sedition. And at the same time, she doesn't want to be supporting the colonizer that is colonizing her country and her people. So she needs to find a way to walk the middle line. And this is something we'll be talking about. She does this through her radio programs. Okay. All right. So next slide.
All right, so this one's air raid precaution services.
Okay, so something really interesting that I got to learn, and I have an acknowledgement slide at the end, but one really incredible privilege that I had was to be approached by someone who was really interested in Chitale just as a kind of physician, researcher who is also heading up a Marathi theater company here in Kansas City. I'm not in Kansas City, but he's in Kansas City. And he wrote to me, and then we subsequently found out that he was related to Chitale's family. And so he was able to connect me with her daughter and her husband, who shared stories with me. And something I learned, there were two things I learned. One was that Chitale, so I'm going to back up a little bit. In my excitement, I jettisoned over how she got to the UK in the first place. So let me back up and share that with you. So as I said, she was born in 1912, and she is raised in Pune and then eventually closer to Mumbai. And she attends a really elite women's school called Wilson College. And she studies there. And while she's there, she meets a South African former nun named Johanna Dupree. And Dupree and Chitale become very good friends. And Dupree encourages her to go to London to pursue further education. And Dupree herself is going to be studying at Oxford. So they go together. Chitale studies Montessori education at University College London, joins Dupree in Oxford, and she stays on in Britain for the next 14 years and has a really wonderful time. All of her recollections, according to her critics and her family, were really glowing. She had an exceptional experience. Dupree introduced her to a lot of her own friends. And so what's really remarkable to think about is that when she arrived in 1934, she could not have imagined that she would be in the middle of a world war, right? Um, and what she does in 1939 is she decides that she wants to be contributing to the effort. And so she joins what's called the Air Raid Precaution Service. And these are people who volunteer to assist people into bomb shelters when bombs were being dropped on various parts of the country. And so in one of, there's a scholar named Vijaya Dio, and forgive my pronunciation of the name, but Professor Dio looks at, well, she interviewed Chitale extensively, and she's written a book in Marathi, which Dr. Udayan Apte was able to translate parts of for me very generously. And what she shares is that so she's talking with Chitale, and she also talks to a number of her friends, and her friends point out that Chitale was a really lively, charming, sprightly person, very engaged, very interested in the world around her. Journalistically, she was known for this sort of light, pleasing, frothy quality of her voice. These are the terms used in the various texts that describe her. And so she is sharing with her friends and tells them about how she would get dressed to do her work. So she would wear her helmet and her boots and her sari. And one of her colleagues and associates on this air raid force sort of was chuckling about, like, wow, what an interesting kind of set of features you have here with your sari, and you look funny, she said. But she was amused and tickled by this. And for Chitale, based on what I've read and what I've been told, she was really a very matter-of-fact person, and she was interested in learning, interested in doing, and just really engaged in the world around her. So she contributed to this in 1939, but very quickly they sent her off to the Ministry of Information because they thought, it's great that you're helping us, but I think you could do translation for them and you would be even more of an asset to them. And then they subsequently send her to the BBC. And so the story continues on to next slide, 5.
Okay, great. So this is the kitchen in wartime.
Yeah, so this, I think we might want to go one more slide. So this is what you're seeing are the postings on the BBC Genome, which lists all of the programs that have historically been presented on the BBC. And then Dan, I think the next one is the Radio Times slide, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, so this was in the Radio Times. You can see the kind of advertisements that she had on this site when it was there. And I'll tell you about the quote on the slide in just a moment. So now Chitale in 1940, Britain launches, or sorry, the BBC launches its Indian service. But right now, Chitale is working on the domestic service. And that means that this program is being broadcast to British listeners, and it's called The Kitchen in Wartime. Now, as we discussed before, the Blitz caused a number of food shortages, and Churchill has various ways of dealing with these. But one of them is to really encourage a vegetarian diet because meat is rationed. Now, it's really difficult to say whether Churchill was directly involved with the BBC or not, but we do know that the BBC is a government arm. And so there were two remits driving the BBC. One of them was by its founder, John Wraith, who was interested in the BBC being a source of moral instruction. So he was Scotsman, a devout Christian, really committed to making sure that the BBC was instructing the people and serving as a vessel for communicating worthy ideas and educating them. But the other remit is to garner support for the war and foster solidarity and find ways for Britain as a people, as a collective, to be stoic, maintain a stiff upper lip, and also engage in a way of being that we refer to as doing your bit. And for more information about this, you can read both um, Churchill's Secret War and then Sonia Rose, who writes about Britain in her history of Britain in World War II. It's called Which People's War. So what Chitale is doing then is she's part of this program called The Kitchen in Wartime, and she's tasked with teaching people how to make vegetarian meals. And so, Dan, I wonder if I could ask you please to read the quote that's on this slide.
Of course. So here it is. Of course, they do take a little more time than it would take to open a tin, but actually there are many which do not take so very much time, only about 10 to 15 minutes more than it would take to cook vegetables in the ordinary way. And as for elaborateness, once you grasp the foundation of the curry, the rest is simple.
Okay, thank you. And then if we could go to the next slide.
Okay.
So here's some more passages from Chitale, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And then
okay, sure. So you see, in my community in India, meat, fish, and eggs have been unknown as foodstuffs for nearly 3,000 years. There are other communities who eat meat only once a week or so, and even those who eat it regularly can prepare equally nourishing dishes if meat is unattainable. The ideal diet in my community would consist of milk products, lentils, and other pulses, rice, wheat, and similar grains, and lots of vegetables. And then the other one is, I know you have a dish which you call sausages and mash. I also have a dish which I call bean sausages and mash. I cook the beans until tender, butter beans, haricot vert, or any beans I can get, then mash them fine with a fork, adding some mashed potato and a little flour to hold the mixture together. Then add pepper, salt, and flavor with sauce or parsley. Shape into thin sausages, roll in breadcrumbs, and fry till brown. I pile these sausages onto a nice heap of mashed potato and pour a thick gravy over the lot. For the gravy, I use one of the non-meat gravy preparations, but of course there are many other gravy preparations on the market too. A little fried tomato goes very well with this dish, and a green vegetable completes it.
Okay, so I hope we're not making you too hungry. We were talking before we started about how in an open world we might have made some of these dishes and served them, which maybe we can still do that one day. So here's what I would like to draw to our attention as we think about these passages from the two different episodes of this program that Chitale offers us. So there are three things that she emphasizes. She emphasizes the nutrition value of these dishes, right, to people who are accustomed to eating a meat diet. She points out that they're easy, right, because there's a perception of curry as being difficult and time intensive. And she emphasizes that they are delicious. And these three things are important partly, well, there are two ways in which I suggest that this program works. So the first is she's really trying to advocate for a vegetarian diet, and she's addressing the concerns she knows would have been in the minds of her listeners at the time. And one of them that was pretty significant was the idea of nutrition and whether they were getting enough nutrition. Now, in doing this, Chitale's doing kind of two political things at the same time. So if you remember, we were talking about how she's in this rock and a hard place, right? On one hand, she is living as a colonial subject in wartime Britain. And this is a time when Britain is particularly concerned about sedition or treason or anything that's going to destabilize it any further, given that the war is already knocking at its door and affecting people in a really significant way. Now, the Quit India movement that we talked about happens in 1942. The Blitz happens in 1940. But the whole time before the Quit India movement, we're moving closer and closer to it. So nationalism is escalating, and people in India are more and more skeptical about, I don't know if we should have to support this war. This isn't our war, it's your war, right? So we have this concern in Britain, and there were actually 6 people that the government considered interning the way that the Japanese were interned in the United States. Now, that doesn't end up happening, but Chitale's concerned about this. So she really wants to show, like, hey, I'm doing this. I've done this for a really long time, and I'm healthy, I'm okay, and you can do it too. And it's not so difficult. And it's not really even that different. All you have to do is replace a few beans for your meat products. And I will say that I looked for pictures of beans, sausages, and mash and couldn't find anything that looked like you would want to see it on a slide. So we opted for lentil cutlets instead. So anyway, let's go on to the next slide.
Okay, sure.
And I'm sorry, we're getting close to 9 o'clock, so I'll try to wrap things up. Or sorry,
Oh, no,
I'm on Eastern
well.
time, 6 o'clock.
Okay, so this is Chitale invokes Gandhi.
Okay, so I'll get to the quotes in just a second. So she's demonstrating her loyalty, and she's saying, I sound different than you. I probably look different than you. I have eaten differently than you, but really I'm not so different from you. And we're all in this together. We all are cooking vegetarian together, and we don't have to feel the effects of the war so much. We can do this. And in other parts of the program that I didn't cite, she talks about her flatmate and how the flatmate really comes to love these dishes, even though she feared she couldn't get along without meat. Now, there are 2 things she's doing. So I showed you how she does appeal to her British listeners, but she also doesn't want to be going against anything related to the Indian move towards independence. And so some of the stereotypes that people have about Indians have to do with this theory about martial races. And this means the Brits actually divided ethnic groups of Indians into those that they thought were physically stronger, particularly the Afghans and the Punjabis, so people from northern India. And they associated this strength and their larger size with the fact that they were meat eaters. And then the non-martial races, who they categorize as effete. And this kind of characterization is common among colonizers for the people that they colonize. So this is not new, that this theory of martial races affected who they recruited for the army. But in kind of talking about the strength that is possible in a vegetarian diet, Chitale is kind of unconsciously or implicitly invoking Gandhi. And what I mean by that is Gandhi really advocated for a vegetarian diet, and he explains that he actually succumbed to eating meat and felt that maybe this is what he should do because he doesn't want to be classed as weak, and he's convinced by a friend to do this. And eventually he comes around to saying, well, maybe fortitude doesn't come from what you consume, but the choices that you make, your ability to withstand or withhold or abstain. So with that, I'd like you to hear these 2 quotes. Dan, I wonder if I could ask you to read the one from Gandhi's friend first, and then we can read Chitale's kind of rebuttal to it.
Okay, sure. So this is from Gandhi's friend. We are weak people because we do not eat meat. The English are able to rule over us because they are meat eaters. You know how hardy I am and how great a runner too. It is because I'm a meat eater. Meat eaters do not have boils or tumors, and even if they sometimes happen to have any, these heal quickly. Try and see what strength it gives.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, this is Gandhi's friend, and Gandhi eventually gives into this, and then he feels really bad, and so he confesses to his family. I mean, it's more complicated than this, but he eventually comes around to being really firm. And then in his autobiography, there are further examples of how he is really pushed when he comes to study in the UK. he's pushed to eat meat, and he resists and rebuts arguments that he should do this. Now, there's nothing in the text that explicitly says she was referring to Gandhi. This is the way that I read these between the lines of this broadcast and transcript. And when Dan shares the research he's done on the novel, we'll talk more about Chitale's relationship with Gandhi. But here's the way she refutes this. And Dan, let you take it away again.
Okay, sure. So in one of the broadcasts, she says, "We have lived on this diet for centuries. Our soldiers have fought, our laborers have worked, and our brain workers and others have flourished. I can tell you my uncle once pulled a cow out of a well single-handed. And please do not think this is just an Oriental legend. But even if these should be considered exceptions, there are the normal people who live normal, healthy lives on a completely meatless, fishless, and eggless diet."
Okay, so don't try this at home, folks. I think so. She is, again, really emphasizing the ways that these kind of stereotypes that people have about Indians living in Britain as being effete, as being different, as being other. She's kind of implicitly responding to those, both to earn the trust of her listeners in Britain, but also to push back, however subtly and implicitly, against the kinds of misconceptions that people have. So this is, I mean, there's more one could say about this program, but these are kind of the big highlights. And yeah, should we go on to the next slide?
You got it.
Thanks.
So this next one is how the Blitz affected food access.
Okay, so we kind of talked about this earlier. So ports. Let's try this one more time. Ports are blocked off. Britain can't receive the food that it normally imports, which is about 75% of their food. And so Churchill decides to make some agricultural policies in India that involve really drawing very, very heavily on foodstuffs from Indian farmers. And this ends up being quite extreme. And so Britain is relying on India for three things. It relies on India for soldiers, so for people power, or well, at the time it would have been called manpower, but we can say for bodies. It relies on India for natural resources and food, and institutes policies to import really significant amounts of it, so much that a number of Indians are really critical of how much is being taken from them. And of course, colonizers have histories of plundering their colonies. And this results in famine in Bengal, and I'll get to that in a moment. The third thing they really need in order to get these other two things or get buy-in is the support of Indian intelligentsia who are increasingly anti-British, because they really need Indian support to win this war. And so along comes, next slide.
Okay, so this is Churchill responds agriculture policies in India.
Okay, sorry, I jumped the gun. So we can go to the next one, yeah.
Okay. All right, so this is pro-war propaganda. Britain recruited forces from its colonies.
Okay, so yeah, this is what we were talking about earlier, that they're recruiting Indian forces. You'll notice in the picture that the majority of people represented there are white, but there are token quote unquote soldiers from other parts of the colonized world. But the number of people they drew was really pretty significant. I don't have a number in front of me. I do remember, though, that in World War I, there were at least 1 million soldiers that came from other parts of the world that were not formally conscripted, but definitely drawn in. Okay, and now, next slide.
Okay, so this is BBC Indian Service, launched May 1940.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. Okay, so I'm going to try to wrap up here so there's enough time for both of us to share with you about the novel and its connections to this. So the Eastern Service, or the Indian arm of the Eastern Service, because it broadcast in various parts of the Middle East as well, and East Asia, um, it was designed to be a propaganda tool to give people in India, listeners in India, a sense of Britain as positive, of its people as positive, as of its culture as interesting and knowledgeable and learned. And um, again, there's so much one could say about this, but what I'll say right now, and we can come back to this if we have time, is that Chitale broadcast on a series called Through Eastern Eyes. And this was produced in part by George Orwell, who at the time was hired as the talks director on the BBC. And Chitale initially started out as his secretary, and then she eventually does more and more broadcasts of the kind that I'm about to describe. And this is when she also starts narrating news and music programs in Marathi. But this program was in English. And the episode that she presents that I'm interested in is called Then and Now. And there, again, forgive me for going so quickly, try to expand later. What she does is she gives examples of about 7 different women, British women, that are her friends or her associates. And she talks about then and now. So then was when there was no war. And this is she's broadcasting this on New Year's Day, 1942. And the now is in the moment of the war. And each of these women is shown as having made some major sacrifice. So remember, we're talking to Indians who feel that they're being asked to give something for a war that's not about them. So Chitale, again, between this rock and a hard place, is trying to establish that she's not engaged in sedition, but she also doesn't want to toe the line. And so what she tries to show is that these British women are giving of themselves, giving of their time, giving of their bodies. So there are repeated images of people, women who are sort of soft and socialite, and she refers to their hands being initially soft and manicured and then later becoming gnarled from gardening, but and cooking and cleaning. But that increased wear and tear on the body is accompanied with an amount of tremendous pride that they have in what they're doing. And so, Dan, I think, is there a quote on this one?
I don't think so. No,
It
it's
might be
just
the next one.
Orwell and then Chitale
Yeah.
and Bukhari.
Try it. Yeah, here we go. Try the next one.
Okay, yep. So through Eastern Eyes, the hand that rocks the cradle, then and now. And then, yeah, there is a quote from her. Do you want me to read that?
Yeah, if you could. So the quote Dana's going to read is how she concludes this. And as Dana's reading, note the way that she is implicitly including herself in this description.
There are few women today in Britain who are doing just the ordinary jobs of a woman. 'Tis hers, they say, to cook and feed the beast. 'Tis hers also to nurse and rear the babe. But women in this war have shown that it is hers also to do more. Hers is a double task. There is no exception for her from the tasks which are her birthright. She still has to cook and feed the husband. She still has to nurse and rear the babe. But she is capable and she is doing also the jobs of men. Before the war, women worked, it is true, but mainly at tasks congenial to them. Today, they are active and efficient in all the spheres of public effort.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Yeah, so again, look, she's showing us how women are doing what women are tasked with doing traditionally, but then they're also taking on the tasks that were being done by men who are now going off to the front. So I am going to show you one last slide here. Last one, I think, Dan. This is Tara
Yep, so
Beg.
this is Tara Ali Beg speaks out against British policies.
Yeah, so she talks about famine in an interview that was done by the BBC with Tara Beg that was subsequently used in a different set of programs. It was an Empire retrospective called The Crown and the Lotus. But Beg talks about how nearly 60 million people die of starvation in the Bengal famine. And that is, from her perspective, and historically it's been established as well, that it is tremendously exacerbated by the British reliance and some would say plundering of supplies. Now, it's important to note that Chitale would not have known that this was happening at the time, because the famine strikes fully in 1943. But what I'd like for us to see is the way that she's just continually walking this really fine line, and does so with tremendous grace and skill at a moment when it's not so easy to do this. So I'm gonna, if you go to the last slide, this is just my acknowledgement slide, thanking Dan, thanking UNR, and I can do this at the end, but yeah, I'll stop here and let Dan share what you'd like to. And I hope I left you enough time.
Oh, definitely, yes. So I just wanted to, well, so first of all, I want to welcome anyone to type any questions into the chat. We do have about 20 minutes for questions, which is great. So I'll kind of read those as I go, and we can kind of respond to those. But I also just wanted to take the chance to talk to you a little bit about her first novel, which is called In Transit. I talk about it a little bit in my book, but it's a really fascinating novel. It's very capacious. It's like a 3-generation historical novel. And, you know, there's a number of different things we could talk about in relation to it. I don't think it has necessarily a lot to do with food, but definitely some interesting things happening with the book's kind of representation of feminism, especially, you know, the point that you just made is, you know, women end up doing the jobs of men during World War II. And of course, you know, what we all know is, like, once you let the genie out of the bottle, it's not going to go back in, right? And at the same time, there are, you know, regulations in place at the BBC that, you know, would not allow her to be too overtly feminist, because they were afraid that it might offend some of the listeners, right? So getting back to this point of having to really walk a fine line, you know, that's a really good example of it. And then the other thing that I find really interesting in Transit, and Sejal, I wonder how you kind of read this, is its management of the sound space, because a lot of the chapters will have a kind of overall national picture, and then it will kind of zoom into the family, right? So we could think about it in filmic terms, but for the most part, it's kind of sound cues that actually affect that transition, I found.
I think that's so interesting. And one of the really wonderful things about your chapter, Dan, is the way that you talk about how her writing may be something we can read through the work that she does on radio, right? That there's experimental elements that she uses in her radio programs that filter into how she writes. And to your question, one could really think about how so much of, and again, using the term Indian is always tricky because it's very capacious. We're talking about, you know, at the moment, 1 billion people, right? But in this particular space that she's looking at, there's a tremendous tradition of oral culture, whether we're talking about religion, which is invoked, right? The way that people pray in the novel, the way that people socialize in the novel, the way stories are passed down from, because as Dan said, it's a multi-generational novel. So the stories are passed down from one, you know, from great grandparents to grandparents to others. I don't know if this is what you're getting at, Dan, but there is a lot to do with that. And there's a lot of song in the novel too.
No, that's true. Yeah. A lot of times the way the nationalist movement enters the novel is through either a character singing a song or hearing a song in the street and it getting repeated. Yeah. And, you know, it's, on the one hand, the story of the nationalist movement growing, which is a kind of exciting force. But on the other hand, one of the things that's so powerful about the novel as a novel is that it also, you know, leads very indirectly to the breakup of this extended family, right? And we see this a lot in Indian novels at the time, but it's kind of more emotionally mature than just a kind of straight ahead support of the nationalist movement, because it also kind of charts the intergenerational disagreements and everything, and ultimately the breakup of their house.
Yeah, it kind of, if we're thinking about it in terms of the current moment, like I happen to be living in Britain during Brexit, and it's really true. Families really did lose contact with each other, stop talking to each other because of their really strong political views. And the same is true um, as people have talked about the previous administration, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way that the current divisiveness of politics actually filters into our everyday lives or our cultures. And Chitale's novel stops in the early 30s. And um, what's exciting about working with Dan is that you're looking at how radio influenced the novel. And for me, when I look at the novel, which was written in 1950, it gives me an idea of what kind of world Chitale came from and how that world would have shaped or been a filter through which I can understand the content of her programs. Because she doesn't take a side in the novel, just like she doesn't overtly take a side in the programs. She really shows you both sides and how they collide with each other.
Mm. Yeah, she's in the kind of true Mukashian spirit of the historical novel by having characters who are on both sides of the question, and then just kind of seeing what happens to them rather than necessarily having one hero. Although I also feel like it's very clear that the young woman in the youngest generation is clearly the kind of protagonist, sort of, at least towards the end. And then of course her supportive grandfather as well. He gives up all worldly possessions and goes and joins the movement. So I think it's not entirely unclear which side she's on, but the novel itself, you're right, does a good job about balancing it, and brings the debates into the novel itself. So you see characters on both sides debating it there. It's not like taken for granted.
Yeah, actually, I'm sorry, I should have been more clear. The narrator doesn't take a position, but the novel does.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's a better way to say.
Yeah.
They're
I'm
questions.
also curious a little bit, especially since you mentioned the kind of that little excerpt. It was a tricky one for me when I was writing about her work, because both the novel and some of her broadcast work repeat the kind of social feminist standpoint, which is that like women should have a place in public, and they should have political representation, but it's because they are mothers and wives, right? So it's like kind of tricky in that sense, right? Like, in other words, like they're still advocating for political rights and representation and all of that, but because they have to raise children, and men are going to be completely useless in that process, etc., right? And that was in the little passage that I just read in it, and there are characters, not all characters in the novel, but there are characters in the novel who also kind of share that viewpoint. So I'm just kind of curious how you have kind of wrestled with her feminism, which we know, she couldn't be too over the top on the BBC because they were afraid of alienating listeners, right? But I'm just kind of curious to see how you've kind of parsed that.
Still parsing.
Yeah.
So I just thinking about it now in real time. Tell me what you think about this. I find it hard it's so challenging, I think, to ascribe intention, right, to what she or anybody did, right? So when we read these programs, I can't say Chitale definitely meant to say this or say that about Gandhi. I can only say, when I read this, it evokes this for me. And I wonder if she's evoking this or how this would have landed.
Right.
And Sonia Rose talks about this. She doesn't talk about the BBC directly, but she does talk about how there's a way in which women would have had to frame their feminism in this way, that maybe there's something about the stage at which feminism is in this moment that requires what feels to us like a putting forward and pulling back. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, that's one reason why I ended up having that chapter be both about Chitale and Atiya Hussein, and
Hussein,
Hussein
yeah.
was much more outspoken, so they're an interesting pair in that sense, obviously coming from very different worlds, but then at least on the context of the BBC, kind of like being put forward as like, here's the Indian woman,
Yeah.
but they're actually quite different, aside from the fact that they're both authors and broadcasters, right? So we have a question about one of the quotes that you used, Sejal, which is this is from Inez, and asks, or it starts out, Eastern countries were ahead of the European culture when it came to diet for sure, but out of curiosity, was Gandhi's friend Indian or was he European?
No, he was Indian. Actually, he was somebody he grew up with, and they were teenagers when this episode takes place. This is a great question. I should have clarified that. Um, he Gandhi eventually decides that he's a really bad influence and doesn't want to be friends with him anymore. But he is, I guess he was a friend of Gandhi's older brother, and the older brother was a little bit skeptical of this character, but Gandhi befriends him and then eventually unfriends him. Is that a word? I guess it
Yeah,
is
yeah.
now. Okay. Yeah. But to further to your question, there were a number of Europeans who tried to push back on Gandhi's vegetarianism, and he rebuts them. And then there's also the Vegetarian Society. So this was a movement headed up by people like George Bernard Shaw and Edward Carpenter in the late 19th, early 20th century. So Gandhi has his supporters too.
Yeah, so there was like a pre-existing vegetarian movement in the UK, but it's just kind of this historical confluence, where meat is hard to come by, and at the same time they have Chitale in town, and so so she
Yeah.
ends up giving recipes over the air. And obviously the quotes that you picked are kind of the more contextual ones, but at other moments she repeats recipes, like start by doing this, and then you put this ingredient in, and then I use half teaspoon of this, right? And a lot of times she'll actually say it twice because it's just over the radio. There is no kind of replay, so people are frantically scratching down how to make these recipes. But yeah, it's such a fascinating thing, especially since curries end up taking off and being so ubiquitous in UK culture,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's curry and chip shops now.
Right.
Yeah.
And not that it was entirely just Chitale telling people about it, but it's an important kind of tipping point after World War II. It becomes much more widespread.
Well, and the BBC is a really kind of centralizing force in Britain at the time, right? You can imagine lots of people sitting around listening to their wireless sets.
Mm-hmm. So another question that some of my students have is, how do you read the relationship between George Orwell and Chitale?
There's not, Dan, I'm wondering if you found things about this. I recently stumbled on Orwell's letters and he almost never mentions her. So, and when I spoke with Nandini Apte, her daughter, they don't really, from my sense, have a lot to share about it, except that she was just seen as someone who was really congenial and someone who really kept her focus on her work and was very professional with people and cordial. But um, it sounds like that the relationships were quite formal. What do you
Mhm.
have a sense of this?
No, I think you're absolutely correct. There's he seemed to have a very high opinion of her, and I'm assuming vice versa, but I guess I don't know. But there was one really interesting breakdown in their relationship, possibly, although I'm not exactly sure how to read this, but basically, there was someone who was writing news reports for the Eastern Service, and they got banned by the Ministry of Information. They basically got blacklisted, right? And so what they ended up doing is he kept writing them anyways, and he would just give them to someone else, and then they would read them. And Orwell was either actually mad or pretending to be mad because Chitale was in on it. She knew that this was happening and just kind of kept it from Orwell. So whether he was just feigning that he was upset about it and he had actually been in on it, which I kind of suspect because he was in on a number of other kind of plots. Like he would kind of plot with the enforcer, because rather than having, sometimes it was just you weren't allowed to mention certain names if they were too anti-imperial or whatever. But occasionally they weren't supposed to mention, to the extent possible, specific works that were banned in India. But you could still mention the author, right? And you could still mention the other texts of theirs that were not banned or not yet banned. And so I did find some evidence of Forster and Orwell working together, where Orwell would tell Forster, well, you can't mention this particular text, but maybe you can mention another one of his or whatever, right? So this is what makes me wonder if Orwell was just pretending in his diary that he didn't know about it, but he actually did. Or maybe it was really a surprise. I don't know.
The other thing I'm remembering now is I haven't read about this, but I remember speaking with another colleague and friend of ours, Jennifer Nesbitt, who talks about how there were scripts that, I don't know if she wrote them, but she was involved with writing them, but they were read by someone else. But there's no evidence that I found, at least in Chitale's papers, that suggest that she harbored any kind of negative feelings about Orwell. But Orwell does eventually get really disillusioned and leaves the BBC.
Right. Yeah, so he felt
he's tired of towing the line. He feels like it doesn't make an impact, and he's really discouraged.
Yeah, mostly discouraged by the sense that not that many people were listening. But on the other hand, he knew that going in. I think that was the whole reason why they were allowed to have discussions about Proust and Joyce and everything else, which is so wonderful in terms of literary history, because the amazing thing about the Indian service was the idea of the audience was incredibly intellectual. And so during World War II, when the BBC Home Service is dumbing down their service and trying to play uplifting music and give uplifting talks and comedy and everything else, the Indian service has Ian Forster, Orwell, Venu Chitale, all these other people giving, T.S. Eliot giving these really highbrow literary talks, right? And that's one of the many things that's so interesting about the Indian service, in my mind, is like it becomes a kind of precursor for the third program.
The third program, right?
Yeah.
Well, and actually, if you look at the people that worked on the Indian service, at least in the early 40s, I would say 2/3 of them are writers.
Yeah.
And they're all diaspora, but they're all writers, some literary. Cedric Dover was a scientist, I think, but there are a few non-writers, but most of them are intellectuals. And I think that's really fascinating in terms of who is being represented and what they're representing.
Yeah, definitely. So Sage, we're coming up on time. Do you have any last comments or ideas for us?
Comments or ideas? I think, no, I really want to thank you, Dan, for organizing this and for all of our collaborations, which I look forward to continuing. And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. And hope you are now inspired to go seek out curry. And I think, I do want to take a moment to thank Chitale's family, to thank Dr. Apte, also the incredible staff, and I'm sure you experienced this too, Dan, at the British Library and the BBC Written Archive Centre, who were just so brilliant and resourceful and cheerful about digging through boxes of microfiche and helping you find what you need to. I'd also like to thank Melissa Pawson, who is assisting me with research and particularly making visual materials accessible to me, reading them aloud from microfiche and so on. So thank you, everybody.
Great.